All right. Hello and welcome to the third JoyPac hyper casual game webinar, where we talk about mobile games, hyper casual games specifically, but also kind of like explore a few other things and kind of work our way through the development cycle of games from the first design to publishing and what follows afterwards. And we have two awesome guests with us again today. Would you like to introduce yourselves real quick?
Sure. Hey everyone, my name is Ajay. I've been working in ad tech now close to 6 years. I'm currently working at Unity as a partner manager. And for those of you who don't know, Unity is the world's largest real-time 3D development platform. Our engine is used across multiple different industries such as construction, architecture, film, but we're most widely known for our presence in the gaming sector. The vast majority of mobile games in the market today are built in Unity. And just to add a little more context, I'm part of the Unity ads team, and we help developers in 3 different ways: through acquire, engage, and monetize. Acquire is focused on user acquisition, engage is focused on the live ops piece, and monetize, the team that I'm a part of, we help developers grow revenue. And yeah, looking forward to discussing a bit more about that today.
Cool. Hi, everyone. My name is Nate Boecker. I'm part of the business development team at Colibri Games. Colibri Games was founded about 4 years ago as Fluffy Fairy Games, so you might be familiar with us in our previous name. We changed our name about 2 years ago, and we're recently acquired by Ubisoft and joined that family. Our primary game is Idle Miner Tycoon. Our objective is to be the world's largest player-oriented, player-focused idle game company. So we're primarily focused on idle games. We have about 1 million DAU, about 10 million MAU. And for those who aren't aware, I will talk a little bit about idle games a bit later, but the principal idea with these are games that you cannot lose, where your progress increases while you're not playing, increases incrementally. So a lot of our experience and perspective is derived from that first game, Idle Miner Tycoon, as well as our second title, Idle Factory Tycoon, and a few other things that we've got cooking. I'm really excited to be here and share some of our experiences, particularly on the ad side, so we can help people who are looking to grow their businesses or their games with ads that are user-friendly and also help to drive revenue. So thank you for inviting me.
Cool, yeah, thanks for being here. And I'm Falko, I'm a publishing manager at JoyPac. We're a publisher for a mobile game publisher with a double setup, with half of our team being in Beijing, China, and half of our team being in Copenhagen, and a few people across Europe. And in the beginning, we were very specialized in bringing games to China and helping Western publishers or self-publishing developers to bring their games to that market. And recently, we've transitioned more and more into publishing our games outside of China as well. So yeah, looking to work with different studios and on different games to kind of bring them to the people there. In China, we've already been fairly successful over the last, our company is only about 2 years old, but yeah, in China, we have been very successful during the first year. Right now, we are at around 100 million downloads overall in our portfolio, now hoping that we can extend that into other markets as well, doing with a couple of games already, Oddman by Setsnail, for example, and a few others. Yeah, and hoping to grow that. And yeah, today we want to talk about monetization. Before we jump into that, I'm going to start a little poll here for the people that are watching us right now. So for everybody watching, this should pop up on your screens now. I give you a minute or two to kind of like answer this quick question so we can get a little bit of an idea of our audience. In the meantime, let's talk a little bit about kind of how the current situation has affected things, both on like the monetization side specifically, but also just overall. Like, do you feel kind of like a curve of how things with the whole pandemic has affected your business? Is it going slowly back to normal? What are you guys looking forward to most when things are like the regular business again?
Yeah, I can speak from the ad network perspective. We saw like a massive explosion in terms of all metrics, in terms of installs, in terms of users, daily active users. Everything just went up and to the right. This started around February, beginning of March, when the pandemic first happened. And of course, when people are in lockdown, they're looking for ways to entertain themselves. So gaming has massively exploded. So we saw engagement go through the roof on both mid-core, hardcore, and hyper-casual games as well.
Yeah, we saw similar patterns starting around February and March. In particular, in the early days, this was localized, I think, to countries and regions that were experiencing more of the dramatic effects of the lockdown. If they were in a lockdown with increases in engagement, I think a lot of the players that we saw that were coming on at this point tended to be less monetized and maybe more, you know, maybe they were engaged, maybe they're interested, but they weren't really spending as much. I think since maybe about April, May, this has abated somewhat. And we're seeing kind of a return to more of our regular engagement patterns. I mean, it was interesting for like a few months, basically, we just had like a long weekend, it felt like, in terms of the patterns. There were no more spikes or anything, no more dips, troughs, or anything. And now it's beginning to look a little bit more normal. Also on the monetization side, we saw sort of in the beginning, there was a lot more ad traffic if we were acquiring players, but there was also a lot more impressions as we were trying to monetize the players that we had recently acquired. So what this meant for us was that in some cases CPMs declined. I think this was particularly true for not just us, but a lot of the people with sort of similar ad setups that were using networks that tended to be more brand focused or had more traffic that was from events, travel, and maybe some retail. Those networks tended to decrease in their in some of the performance KPIs. That I don't think has changed as much, although the total impression count is down, so we can then shift out usage of some of those networks to some degree and push traffic over to the networks that are a bit stronger and probably ultimately more performance driven around games.
Yeah.
So
yeah, you mentioned something interesting, how like it was, you could see it in certain geos first, right? For us, that was very strong because China was obviously hit first, right? And went into lockdown in February already, and kind of like just after the Chinese New Year when people were home. So we saw the huge spike there first when it was still kind of new and nobody knew what to do about it. And then kind of people figured out, hey, more demand, but also more people trying to use the situation, so to speak, to kind of like advertise and like, yeah, get to the additional eyeballs, and then it kind of normalized again. Cool. So our poll is over, and there's a very clear kind of like winner, so to speak. So we asked people what their main issues are when monetizing hyper casual games, and 75% of people mentioned that the right amount of ads that doesn't affect the retention as much. Kind of like, yeah, how bothersome can you be with certain players before they're kind of like dropping out? And hyper casual, that's of course huge, right? Especially because people are testing without any ads in that. And then interstitial is kind of like so ads that automatically play after a certain amount of stages is a big thing. In idle, I feel you're leaning way more heavy on rewarded ads, right? So how's the effect of those? Like, how does that affect you more? Like, and how do you find the right kind of amount of ads to show to people?
Sure, that's an interesting question. So in terms of finding the right amount of ads for us, we've always erred on the side of being nice to the players, which you know, on the one hand, I think it's just a good thing to do in general, to be nice to people as a human being. But I think on the other side, actually, there's a huge business advantage to this, which is that for the most part, what we're trying to do is to increase our margin of error. Because in the early days, of course, we didn't have any A/B testing systems. We didn't have our analytics were much more elementary in terms of what they could track. So it was important for us to make decisions where we were relatively certain we're not going to ruin the player experience, tank our retention, and then destroy the game. So to do this, we made sure that any of the benefits that people were experiencing from ads were pretty profound, and we entirely focused on rewarded video. So we wanted to kind of keep people so that they wouldn't watch too many ads, because we had a feeling this would probably hurt our performance, but had ample opportunities to watch ads that would progress them faster. We found in terms of rewarded video, the benchmarks we got from our partners was probably about 50% of users would watch rewarded video. This is still the case with us. Our partners told us, some of like the ad partners would tell us, okay, of those engaged users, you would usually see around 4 to 6 ads watched per engaged user, okay, per day. We would see somewhere around the neighborhood of 8 on average overall. But this changes significantly, I think, country to country. I think there's different appetites for the amount of ads people are willing to watch in different countries. And there's also differences between ad availability in different countries. So for instance, in Taiwan, we see something like 14, like 10 to 14 ads watched per user per day. There's much more than 8 per engaged user per day. In other places where there's less availability, a smaller fill rate, it can be down to 4. And so we're looking at that, and I'll kind of maybe elaborate more why that's more interesting to us these days. I can elaborate more a little bit further on. But I'd love to hear a bit of the perspective from the more hyper casual side too, from Unity.
Yeah, sure. So we actually recently published a report alongside Adjust, and that was looking at hyper casual performance in Q1. So I can quickly share a quick slide from the report, which demonstrates the number of ads. I'm just going to share my screen. Don't seem, oh, there we go. There we go. So just to share this slide. So what this slide shows is on the left-hand side, you see the retention rate and the number of ads shown, and this is done per minute, right? This data is taken just from Q1 in 2020. So you can see the retention rate is much higher when the number of ads shown per minute is around the 2 mark, and this gradually drops off as the more ads are shown. So the worst retention rate is if you're showing 4 ads per minute and above. So in some games, you can really see more ads than gameplay, and that really has a negative impact on retention rate. So bear in mind, these are just benchmarks, but they give you a good guideline in terms of what kind of performance you can expect depending on how many ads you want to show within a game. So it's being able to strike the right balance between the number of ads shown and having a good retention rate as well. And also, just to share some other information from the Adjust report that we did, you can see at the bottom here, it's revenue per month. And again, it shows the ads per minute on the left-hand side. So the more ads you show, you have a lower amount of revenue per month, and that goes by per minute. And the less ads that you do show, the higher revenue that you do get in terms of the ads shown per minute.
Yeah, very interesting. So you shouldn't be as naive and just say like, hey, I just show an ad after every level or session, but kind of like calculate out how much it usually takes the user to beat a level or to get into a situation where an interstitial ad would be shown, and then kind of, maybe skip every second level or something, so you get up more to this 2 to 3 ads per minute rather than ending up like in the 5 ads. If you have people that are willing to watch a lot of stuff, for example, in rewarded, hey, I can boost my stuff, I don't have a problem with it, I would watch 15, 20 ads if I could, just to get an advantage in the game. Is there such a thing? And like, let's say it doesn't affect your retention that much. Is there such a thing as showing too many ads for a publisher? Is that kind of like do you make as much money on the 15th ad that that a player consumes than with the first? Like, what is the balance there?
So we actually see an inverse correlation in terms of the CPM and the number of ads shown. So the less ads you do show, the higher CPM you're more likely to get. And the more ads you do show, like the repeated ad fatigue that happens, the CPM tends to drop off after that. So yeah, you can have too many ads, so to speak, but it's about striking the balance, right? Even though if you want high CPMs, you still want to have a good yield overall. So that's balancing the fill rate and the CPM as well.
Yeah. So if you take retention into it again, then you would probably hurt yourself in two ways at some point, where it kind of like negatively affects your retention, but also doesn't make as much money for you as you were hoping to. Nate, you mentioned before that at the beginning you started out like not A/B testing a lot with this kind of like, okay, let's just make sure we're not hurting anything overly. Like, how did that evolve from there? How do you now decide like what good placements are? Do you measure that in some way? What is there a specific tool, or do you use internal tools to kind of measure that?
Sure. So yeah, as we were mentioning in the beginning, we weren't particularly, we weren't able to really, measure or test. But what we were able to do was to bring up some kind of establish some benchmarks. And actually, I can share a bit that we have just about. So I'm going to pull this up now. Oh, there we go. And it'll be a window. Okay. Let's see. Are we able to get this?
Yeah, looks fine. Cool.
Yeah, there we go. Great. So we were able to kind of establish some best practices, I think, that really helped to define the ads that we are integrating going forward. Just briefly, right, we talked a bit about idle games, and also kind of a little bit to this part, what ad placements I think are the most powerful. And before we get into this, I think one really important thing is that we've defined within the game key placements and rationalize them based on what's happening in the game itself. So within the game, when you're playing it, it becomes very obvious that there are basically three things that you're trying to balance at all times. So if you play the game, this is abundantly clear, but sort of for our purposes today, you can see that you mine materials within the mines. Those need to be transported by the elevator, and then they are sold over in the right-hand corner in the warehouse. And this then creates sort of three choke points that essentially need to be maximized in order for you to increase the amount of revenue that you're making. Because you don't want your mined materials to just pile up over in the mine and never get transported. So those are three sort of central points that players will quickly run up against. So with that in mind, our monetization, when we chose our locations, it's based around the idea of either you pay on the one hand, or you wait. So it's all about money and time. Maybe less abstractly, here's two examples of this. So if you want to unlock barriers that prevent you from building more mine shafts, well, we throw these barriers in, so you can't just build 100 mine shafts at once, or the limit is 30. So if you want to bypass these faster, you can see there's a little countdown there, 40 minutes, 20 seconds. You can watch an ad that decreases the wait time by 30 minutes. Likewise, on the revenue side, if you want to increase your revenue, increase your pay, you can do so by watching an ad. So these are kind of like the two levers that we have. And we found is that there's some key spots that really drive the ad engagement. So the number one that is the most important for us, we found, would be the idle dollar placement, we call it. And so that's basically, since it is an idle game, when you leave the idle game and you return to it, in the time since you left, we're generating revenue. And so when you get back, you can double that revenue, or in some cases, increase it by 3 point, whatever percent based on other bonuses that you're getting. You can increase your revenue by a multiplier. This is the #1 engagement for us, and is 25% of all engagement of our players, right? So that's a great spot. So 25% of players see this, and they will watch the ad when they come back. There's also, before they leave the game, they can increase the amount of revenue they're going to generate in advance of them leaving, and that's called the ad boost. And this one is interesting because although it's not the highest in terms of engagement, meaning we don't have the most players watching this like we did with the previous one, the players that do watch this are watching a ton of ads, because what they can do is they can front load in segments of 4 hours at a time all of the ads or the bonuses that they're going to get, and they can boost up to like 40 hours. So you'll see somebody, before they go to sleep or something like this, or before they go to work, they're going to watch a bunch of these in advance, see a bunch of ads, and then put the game away. So they come back and they're getting, bonuses from having watched ads before they left, and also bonuses from when they return. This one tends to be the best in terms of just total volume. We have a few others, which were maybe not as popular. For instance, we gave players the option of watching ads to gain back money when they were selling managers within the game. You hire managers that automate work for you. This is only about 2% of impressions. So it was, I think overall, the thing we learned is that the value add of this for the player is pretty limited. So people aren't going to watch so many unless they are, just new to the game, or they're, or alternatively, if they're like power players and they're, into min-maxing every single little part of the game. We found that another placement we had, which I showed you earlier, which is this like skip option within the game, where you can skip the wait time to build new mind jafts, had a low overall engagement, but the people that were watching this, once again, were the more engaged players. It stacks to some degree, so those players were watching, but it wasn't very popular broadly. And finally, we've dabbled with the very simple option of getting free super cash. So of course, in any game, there's multiple currencies, and we said, okay, let's give players the option to just watch an ad and get some free currency. Seems relatively straightforward. It's mostly low engagement, and it can disrupt the in-game economy. But if you want to start to experiment with different offers, with pushing players over to the store or encouraging them to go there, it did have a 14% engagement rate for us when we tested it in our second game, Idle Factory Tycoon. So I don't think it's a completely bad choice, and it's probably easiest to implement for maybe indie developers who are looking for a quick spot just to add another impression or two per engaged users. I think that's most of the slides I have on this one, so I'll stop showing for a second. So what we found is that we have this now, like this kind of playbook. So anytime we're making new games, which we're actively doing, we'll start off and we'll start checking the boxes. Like, do we have this idle dollar one? Do we have the ad location for before people leave? And then we can later on experiment with adding new ones depending on exactly how the game works. For instance, a mine skip region or mine region skip won't always work in every single game because we don't always have mines. But maybe some of the principles behind it do.
Cool. Yeah, super interesting. I'm wondering, I'm not sure if either of you knows that from the top of your head, but does it affect eCPMs where kind of like the ads are placed? Like, is a player, because towards the end of their session, they're much more likely to kind of like click and try out another game than if I want to play Idle Miner Tycoon, I open it up and I see an ad, I'm probably less likely to then just go to another game and check that out, right? Because I'm just starting my my session there. Or is that kind of like a mistake on my side? This is like just as likely for people to kind of try one of the games they're actually seeing ads for.
I think we're we benefit from just the latency and it takes to download games and start playing. So I think from the psychology of the players, of course, you know, we wouldn't be able to monetize with ads if they weren't installing the ads that were being monetized. I've noticed, at least from my own behavior and from talking to some players, that if they do want to try a game, yeah, they'll watch an ad when they first enter the game. They'll click on that. They'll jump over to the App Store, check it out, and, you know, whatever, 5-10% will download that. Then they come back to our game, finish whatever it was that they're doing, and then maybe go play the other one later. I think, you know, maybe it depends also too on the genre, because our game is a game that is played in small sessions over the course of a day, and over maybe, you know, a couple days you're really playing, unless it's like a weekend thing where we have an event and you want to like really spend a lot of time in there. So most players are anticipating they're not going to spend that long in the game anyway. They just want to get in, you know, they'll check all their mines, they'll do all the upgrades, watch all the ads, and out they go. So for those players, you know, when they go out of the game, that other title is sitting there waiting for them to play. That's probably when they would engage with it. Like we've toyed with the idea of doing things like blocking competitors and, you know, getting really hyper specific about which ads will show to be more defensive. But ultimately, I think it ends up being more trouble than it's worth. And you know, modern players are juggling like a handful of games anyway. So we tend to be more liberal in that approach.
Yeah, makes sense. Interestingly enough, for like hyper casual, it's pretty much the same. People move from game to game so quickly anyway that we like it doesn't. There are other things that influence our retention way more than like not showing competitive. Also, there's so much cross kind of like advertisement from other hyper casual games and hyper casual games that if we would block all of those, there would be very little inventory left. But it's very interesting to hear kind of like for the idle game where it's kind of like you have to look for very different kind of points where you can like add on with your monetization, because in hyper casual games there are a few trends that are very much inspired based on like how you can monetize those games. Endless kind of games going away, for example. We had with Fluffy Fall from What Games, a very successful game in China. So we published that game for them in China. But one of the challenges with that game, if you're really good at it, so if you're a really highly engaged player, it takes a very long time until you reach a point where you actually die in the game. That can be 5-10 minute sessions without an interruption. And you don't want to interrupt kind of like the session itself, right? Like during the gameplay, you don't want to just cut it and then let the player continue there without having a natural point where you can kind of do that, because there's like the end of a level or something like that. There's one ad type that we haven't mentioned so far, which is banner ads, which have been a big thing in the past, and then like you see them every now and then. Are they still a thing? Is that something like, is there a certain point in the lifetime, especially for hyper casual games, that go kind of out of fashion after a while, where you should implement them? Is there something where you're actually seeing some numbers, or can you just forget about them at this point?
Yeah, I can speak to that from the network perspective. I definitely still think banners are very much relevant. Even though on desktop they've got a pretty bad rap, they seem to have persisted on mobile. And the main reason being is advertising is a game of real estate, right? So that little bit of space that you occupy when you go from a desktop to a laptop to a mobile becomes more and more valuable. So even though it takes up a little bit of space, there's still value that can be driven from that. So the main benefits of banners are, I would say, they don't really disrupt gameplay. You know, they're unobtrusive, so they don't impact the user experience too much. And from the advertiser perspective, they're really good for driving awareness campaigns, so they have that added benefit. And on top of that, it's just incremental revenue for the publisher. So in addition to interstitials and rewarded videos, banners just end up adding more revenue and increasing your overall ARPDAU as well.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting because I've heard different perspectives from developers. Some kind of fear that it would devalue their ad by feeling cheaper while having banner ads in there. So it's usually later in the life cycle of an app where they implement it. Do you see any kind of like drops in retention or some other changes in user behavior for games that have banner ads implemented?
From my perspective, pretty much all of our major hyper-casual partners, they all incorporate banners in some sort of way. If it's not from the very outset, then they will incorporate it a little bit later on down the line. But everybody utilizes them in some respect. And especially at Unity, it's something that we've focused on in the past couple of quarters and growing because there is a demand for it. And we're seeing revenues increase.
Cool. And one last thing that has maybe to do with like in-game itself before we move on to kind of like the whole back end of things is how ads interact with in-app purchases, right? So Nate, you already mentioned in some cases it's kind of like an either or thing where you can either watch an ad or spend a certain amount of currency. There are, for hyper casual, you see games that just have a purchase that just disables all ads. Or there's a different approach where there's a meta where you can spend money and then automatically, once you spend money in the game, it decreases the amount of ads or even completely disables any interstitial ads to kind of keep those paying players more engaged. What are your guys' take on
that? So we about 50% of our revenue comes from IAP. So we're very much attuned to making sure that we maintain the balance. And I think when we started off and we were a small studio, we wanted to make sure that we weren't spending too much time going in one direction or the other. Which is probably the reason that we just only did rewarded video. I see a question from somebody who was asking if we did interstitials. No, we haven't put any interstitials in our game. We haven't put any banners. And the rationale is that we don't want to, since we have limited resources, we don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole before, looking at the other option. We have experimented with doing a no ad offer in Idle Factory Tycoon, which is our secondary title. This was actually pretty successful. So we found that there are players who will just never want to watch ads. They're willing to pay $2 or $3 depending on the region to watch them, or to never have to. I think it's a bit different since we have only rewarded. So one thing that games back in the day used to do is that if you made any purchase, you weren't going to see any ads. But since we're not forcing ads, we make sure that players can continue to watch them even if they're making a purchase, unless of course they've bought the no ad option. I think for a lot of games that are now experimenting with subscriptions, this is definitely a good item that you can offer as a subscription, since you want something that provides a unique and premium experience for players. So again, that's something that we're looking at. I think the other challenge when it comes to pricing something like a no ad offer is that you're trying to balance a bunch of different things. And this is why it's taking us we're not like jumping into this feet first in our main game, in Idle Miner Tycoon. Because what you're trying to balance is what is the likelihood of somebody making this purchase, right? But what are they giving up? Excuse me, what are they giving up? Like if they're not going to watch ads, then we need to price them as, okay, well, they're in this country, so they're on this device, so they're actually worth XYZ because we would assume they're going to watch all these ads, and their average retention is this, but they're this far along in the game, so maybe they've already seen a few ads. We need to adjust this. And then again, what is the likelihood that they're going to purchase this so that it's profitable for us? I think it's something that is very easy to do incorrectly, particularly if you have rewarded, where it's such a huge amount of revenue. It might be a bit easier on games that are a bit more casual, where for users, almost any amount of a purchase is worth it to turn off ads, right? If you're only showing, if your life expectancy of a user is like a couple days and you're just mostly showing banners, I'll pick on banners for instance, maybe having a lowest tier pricing item for removing ads makes more sense. For us, we're maybe a bit more conservative. I'm not sure if there's like a cool like macro view at Unity when it comes to these types of IAP.
Sure. By an ad network's definition, generally hyper-casual games are games which generate 90 to 95% or more of their revenue from advertising, so in-app advertising. We see very little in-app purchase interactions with these hyper-casual games, so I think you're in a slightly different boat, Nate, in that respect. But most of our partners, the majority of their revenue is all generated through in-app advertising, so very little in-app purchase interaction.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's just much easier for from the hyper casual point of view, right? Because it's also way easier to predict how much a player is worth. Nate, I completely follow your point of like, hey, how much time rewarded ads would that specific player also kind of spend? You never know if that's a person that is only there for a couple of weeks, or if that person will still play the game 8 months from now and would have watched like 100 ads otherwise, right? So it's way harder to kind of like, yeah, calculate that out. All right, yeah, let's move on to kind of like the back end side of things, and kind of first of all, let's explain our audience a little bit about how things work. Like, how do you set this up? There's a lot of talk about the waterfall. Ajay, can you kind of like explain to people, kind of very simple, if you want to have ads in your game, exactly how do you go about kind of like implementing ads in your game, and when you do the first careful steps in optimizing that, what people should look out for?
Sure. So I think when it comes to hyper casual games, you really need to be utilizing all three of the ad formats: interstitial, rewarded, and banner. And once you have a good understanding of your placements, then it's trying to organize your monetization strategy. So utilizing mediation, and you can organize your mediation in a couple of different ways. The most commonly used format so far has been the waterfall, as you referred to. So the waterfall refers to like the traditional programmatic method of ad buying. And the way in which it works is multiple demand sources are organized in a linear fashion from high CPM to low. And a typical example might be Facebook at $50, Google at $45, Unity at $40, and so on and so forth. And when an ad request comes in, whoever's able to serve an impression, they take it. So there's some inherent issues with that, in that it's not really an open auction. It comes down to generally a bias based on historical performance from these ad networks. The alternative to this is in-app bidding. So what in-app bidding is, it's a real-time auction where all the demand sources get to bid on the ad request at the same time. So everybody has an equal and fair chance. And this seems to be the future in which monetization seems to be heading in the industry, because it increases overall competition, and developers tend to see higher amounts of revenue, and it just seems to be the more open, fair, and transparent way in which to operate. So the waterfall and in-app bidding are the two most common ways in which developers can implement a monetization strategy. And you can do that through the use of a mediation, which organizes the whole setup.
And then let's say I have my mediation in there, and kind of want to start, and then I get asked, okay, what is kind of like the floor price you want to set, right? Let's simplify it. Your game is only live in like one geo because you're still testing it. How should you go about kind of like setting that, and maybe explain to people why it's important to kind of pick the right floor price?
Sure. I mean, it really does depend on network to network. Different networks will have different performance, but generally a good place to start is, I think we have high, medium, and low calls. So we generally start with 3 calls per network. That's a recommendation that we see on our side. So a high call generally placed higher up the waterfall, somewhere one in the middle, and one lower, which can pick up a higher number of impressions, but still contribute to overall revenue. And in terms of pricing strategy, I think in tier 1 English speaking regions, you're going to generally have more competitive CPMs. So the likes of the US, UK, Canada, Australia. And from that, you can go to tier 2 regions, such as Western Europe, past the Middle East. And in tier 3, more larger countries such as Brazil, India, Indonesia. I think these are all different countries that you could be targeting. and it all contributes to more revenue if you're targeting more regions, and your user acquisition strategy fits that pattern as well.
Cool. Yeah, Nate, can you talk a little bit about how that end is handled on your side? Is there kind of like an army of people that is optimizing that around the clock, or yeah, how do you go about that?
Sure. So we started off when we were just kind of new, just using a single source of traffic, right? So when we first turned on, we were just using actually Unity because it was already in the game. It was very easy to do. And then we kind of evolved when it came to our approach to mediation. At this point now, we're using a mediator. We're using Max, actually Max and Iron Source and different games. And we're using them in Max, at least, we're using bidders. So we have a hybrid setup. So there are a few networks that are kind of ahead of the, like, at least on the forefront of releasing bidders. And there's sort of a chicken and egg situation when it comes to building big bidders. So I wouldn't begrudge any network that doesn't have them yet. And that chicken and egg situation is that in order for bidders to work, they need data. In order for there to be data, they need a lot of traffic. In order for there to be a lot of traffic, you need a lot of developers who are putting your bidder in, but developers tend to be smart and they don't want to put things in yet that don't have a lot of data. So it can be a bit slow in order, even if the tech is already there, just to implement these things. But a few of the networks do have this these bidders set up. So what we'll do is we'll basically run the bidders at the very top. They're taking whatever ads they want in terms of pricing, right? They're all auctioning. It's an auction against themselves. And then they're also checking before we give the winning ad placement or the winning ad to one of the bidders, we'll check against our waterfall. And the waterfall, we do some A/B testing actually of all of the different line items. So we'll have, you know, a $90 Unity line item, you know, then we'll have like an $85 you know, chart boost line item or something like this. And we'll try and fill all of those. The things that we're balancing when we is overall in the A/B tests, we want to ensure that there is just generally more revenue. We're looking at ARPDAUs to see if they're going up or down, and that's influenced by fill. So the thing that we don't want to do is to create 1,000 line items, because it's going to take, you know, starting at like $100 and going down sequentially like 5 cents or something with every single network that has this capability, because it's just going to take forever and it will time out before the users get to see the ad. So we'll A/B test a bunch of different locations. We work a lot with our, I guess like the publisher relations managers or the account managers to help figure out where we should be in terms of which placements to use. And then we just A/B test them. We say like, okay, it seems there's a lot of great traffic coming from XYZ partner. Let's put them at a higher, like a higher, I guess, line item amount, you know, and then test it. Generally, we try and spread out the overall distribution of all the line items, spread out between networks. We're spreading out between all of the CPM levels, and we're trying to spread out between fill rates. So we don't want something at the, if there's something at the very, very bottom that is getting a ton of fill, then that means that, you know, there's probably more options further up. And we just play with it and balance it as we go. I think in the long term, we'll see more of a transition to just the bidders, so this will become less and less relevant. But we're optimizing by platform primarily and country secondarily. And you have to kind of play with, you know, certain networks will have certain rules in terms of, you know, how many different placements they'll let you have, and you just have to be kind of cognizant of that and try and make sure that you're well balanced. That's mostly our approach. We have one ad ops manager who is doing that mostly now on a part-time basis, because the bidders are taking so much more traffic.
Yeah, that is something that I find very interesting. You mentioned that chicken and egg problem. Do you think now that it being implemented in parallel and the the bidders kind of getting more data, that eventually we'll see that overtake waterfall completely? Because it sounds to like an outsider, hey, this is the easier system, right? Kind of like does the optimization for me.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think some networks are working, some networks and platforms are working to hasten this. I think particularly for companies that have, for ad networks that have their own games, they're able to force this to happen faster. So if we look at, say, Max, they had Lion Studios to basically like bear the brunt of the responsibility of seeing these things optimized. I think it's probably the same case with Iron Source, which has Supersonic Studios, so they can test out their bidders and make sure that the bidders learn. I mean, the challenge with them is that with the bidders in general is that in theory everything is the same, right? So it should all be the same, but in practice, even if the business logic is identical, there are technical differences between the different bidders, and you'll see there's just like this lack of data that will cause results to be different between them. So my guess is probably within the next 9 months, I want to say, we'll see some significant progress there, and it's going to be stop and start, and you'll see a lot of networks will release a bidder, and then you'll hear rumors through the rumor mill that it's not very good, and that's just probably because it doesn't have very much data yet. But we'll get there. I think a lot of the platforms, and I'll turn over to Unity in a second, probably want this transition to happen because it makes everybody's lives easier. It's just a matter of like when that can actually occur. But before I put any words in your mouth, I'll turn it over to you.
No, you're absolutely right, Nate. I mean, Unity completely understands the benefits of in-app bidding. Like, we were probably one of the first movers in the market back in 2016 when we released the unified auction. So we completely understand the benefits of it, but the market wasn't ready for it at that time. But it seems now there's definitely been a lot more traction in terms of adoption, and it seems to be a bit more standardized, and the ecosystem is a bit more receptive to it. So I believe it's only a matter of time before we join the party as well. And I think there's a few other players such as Google who don't currently support bidding. So once these partners can contribute to bidding as well, I think it's going to be probably the future and the way forward.
Cool. Yeah, is there anything else? I would say in a couple of minutes we can move to questions from the audience. We already got a few during the webinar. Is there anything else you want to mention? Anything like interesting points I may have missed? In the meantime, I also will start kind of like one other poll to get a little bit more information about our audience. But yeah, is there anything else you would like to share?
I feel like we covered a lot of the best practices, but one thing I would just reiterate on, which Nate mentioned, is A/B testing. Testing is super important, especially when it comes to hybrid casual games. So you live and die by the amount of testing that you can do, trying to find the optimal placements in terms of ad frequency and location. Just bear that in mind as well when you're designing your game.
Yeah, likewise with testing, I think one important thing when you're testing is those to make sure that you actually get those placements. Like when we're testing our prototypes, we do so with the sort of rule book of placements in mind. And then also, I think one thing that we learned as a side note that might be interesting is that we started using these like play test services, like Playtest Cloud, which is an awesome service. And we discovered very quickly, it's like, oh, actually, if we're going to use this service, we have to make sure that we are testing in an environment that is to some degree similar to how people are actually playing. So this is maybe more technical, but like if you're testing something and you want to test like what is the average player experience in one of these idle games, we discovered we can't do single session tests. So we can't just have somebody come in and play the game for a little bit and then leave and tell us what they think, because for most of our players, if they're playing 15 minutes on average a day, which they are, then we need our, I guess, our testers within, say something like Playtest Cloud which is a distributed user testing platform. We need them to come in for multiple tests. So to do multi-session play tests so that they experience what it's like to return and then have the option to see an ad or not see an ad or spend currency, etc. So for us, it's been really useful to start to understand how that actually works and be a little bit more scientific in our testing.
Cool. Yeah, so we asked our viewers what they think is the best ad placement for hyper casual games, because we talked a little bit about in idle games, it's very strongly leaning towards rewarded video, which is also what the people here answered. 70% of people pick rewarded video as the best placement. Interstitial, very high. Of course, we're talking about hyper casual specifically, where interstitials have a big impact. Do you have interstitials at all in your games, Nate?
No, we do not have any interstitials. We have considered it. We will keep the option open. I think we'll approach this sort of similar to how we approach a lot of our business decisions, or product decisions rather, which is how do we make sure that this doesn't get annoying for players? Right. And a big initiative that we have at Colibri this year is our data initiative. So we're working with a CRM tool just to better track our players and to make sure that we're giving them the best experience possible, and that we're guiding the experience according to their needs. So I think we'll want to, if we do add interstitials, we'll want to do so in such a way that it's only in cases where we don't think that the players are going to be completely annoyed, and that it's conservative at first, and then we can get a little bit more aggressive. We don't want to impact, of course, LTV either, but that's maybe more of a secondary thing to just like overall retention.
Cool, gotcha. Something that got at least a little bit of love in our poll was banners, with still at 22%. Something that wasn't really popular are offer walls at 5%. I mean, of course, with hyper casual specifically, maybe that's a point. Does any of you guys have experience with offer walls and can tell us a little bit about that? Maybe also do a quick explanation for people that don't know what it is.
Sure. Offer walls were first at mobile marketing that I learned about when I Disney when I joined the industry, and I was like, what? You're gonna pay people to play other games? This makes no sense. But that was like 10 years ago. So maybe I'm like dating myself. The idea behind an offer wall is that there's usually a window within the store that you can open up. You open this window and there's a number of different offers for players to engage in in exchange for currency. In the olden days, on Apple, at least, you could usually you would go and install another game. The principle behind this is that if you suddenly wanted to shoot your game up the charts, the App Store charts, you could do so by like heavily pricing your game in all of these offer walls, locking the position, getting everybody to install it. And you would see first the installs would happen, paid installs, then the game would reach the top of the charts, get a bunch of organic installs, and then this would the ROI on this would sort of net out, or ideally be positive. There have been a few platform changes. So for instance, Apple doesn't allow those types of campaigns anymore. I believe Google still does. So we don't have an offer wall. We're open to it. We haven't really added it yet. I think it probably will be around for a while because there are now other types of offers. Right, there's like engagement offers. Oh, get this far in a particular game. There's things that have nothing to do with games. Sign up for a free Netflix trial and you get XYZ currency in the game you're already playing. I think they're interesting, but we're currently not working with them at Colibri. Is there a Unity offer wall at all? I don't think so.
No, currently we don't support any offer walls. To be honest, we haven't really seen much revenue being driven by that, especially in hyper casual. It's almost non-existent in terms of their presence.
Cool. All right, let's see for some more questions here. One we got is, how relevant is it to know your audiences for showing ads? Like, hey, I have a mostly female audience in English-speaking countries? Can you kind of like gear the ads towards that? Is that something you have to worry about as the developer? Kind of like finding the right networks or the right traffic sources that fit that audience very well. Can you have an advantage by doing that?
I think there are definitely networks that perform better in specific geos. For instance, we work a lot with Pangle, which is TikTok's network. So they're owned by ByteDance. It's a Chinese company. They do very well in China, which for us is an important geo. So we make sure that we're integrated with. I think for some of the other things, it depends on how, like, speaking plainly, like if you feel like you want a lot of really good brand traffic, yeah, there are brand networks. A big thing for some for say like Facebook is people need to be logged in, and Facebook needs to recognize that they're a Facebook user. So it's a little bit more involved, I think, when it comes to integrating that type of a network. But of course, there's payoffs. I think for the other networks, they tend to be more contextual. Like, it's this game, and we see this game is shared by XYZ other players who also play these games. So we're going to advertise a bunch here, and then they have all of their data warehouse of all of these other conversion stats that they're going to try and make bets on when they're showing ads. That said, I think there's probably a limited pool of maybe 25 relevant networks, and increasingly over time, a lot of that traffic is shared through exchanges, which is basically like a way for ad networks to bid in each other's traffic. So you'll see that maybe it becomes less and less of a necessary to try and like cherry pick exactly which networks you're going to use. There are exceptions to the rule, but at least that's in my experience.
Yeah, just speaking from the ad network perspective, typically what we see is it comes down to the performance of the algorithm. If you're able to obtain consent from the user, then you can deliver more targeted ads, something that they're more interested in seeing. But if they don't accept the consent, then you can serve more contextual ads, like use lookalike modeling and see what they might be interested in seeing as well. So that's how we typically serve to audiences and try to target.
Cool, yeah, and I think that's something that we'll probably have a webinar in the future where we talk about UA more specifically, and there's probably a bunch of like deep dives that we can do into that on that. All right, yeah, we're almost out of time, so I think we can finish it up here. There are a couple of questions regarding the report you showed earlier, AJ, but of course we'll link those when we post the video to YouTube and JoyPacGames.com as well, so people can look that up. And yeah, other than that, thank you guys so much for being a part of it and taking the time. And I hope you had a good time.
Yeah, thanks a lot, guys.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
I'll start one last poll for our audience about what they want to see next from us. Thanks, of course, for everybody attending here. We had over 80 people watching at one point I saw. So thanks so much, guys, and then hopefully see you again at the next webinar. Take care.